And so that's very easy to remember. It's hearhim.net. So the audios will be on there. So last night we started looking at how God comes to subvert human wisdom, to turn our thinking upside down. And we kind of just gave a very broad context of how we approach the scriptures with that understanding. And we might even have, by the end of today, some opportunity for questions and answers. We used to be in a mode where we answered a lot of questions. When we moved on to questioning all your answers, and we're kind of now at the place where we question our questions. Now, are these the right questions? And it's so important to have the right questions, because, I mean, what's the use of having all the answers to worthless questions? Rather get a question that's worthwhile, that you pursue for your whole life. Much better than having all the answers to questions that's just got no value. So, are we going? Yes, that's going. So, 1 Corinthians 1:25, God says, I will bring the wisdom of man to nothing, and I will bring the knowledge of your experts to nothing. Now, in order for us to understand what is it that God comes to subvert, what is this wisdom that he brings to nothing, we should have an idea of what is human wisdom and what is the knowledge of our experts. Because if we understand that, then we realize what it is that he comes to turn upside down. So we're going to do an abbreviated journey through human history to very quickly start seeing how human civilization has developed and on what basis it developed. Because if we start getting a hold of what is it that constitutes human wisdom, we'll be in a much better position to see how God subverts it. So where does this story begin? This story, let's go right back to Genesis. God says in Genesis 1:26, man is his image and his likeness. Now, when we say the word God, the first time the word God is used in the Bible, Genesis 1 verse 1, it's actually in the plural. Elohim is plural. And God created, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. That's quite an amazing insight to have, that from the very beginning, God is not a singularity, but a relationship. And so when it gets to Genesis 1:26, God said, let us make man in our image and likeness. Again, can you see the plurality, the relationship, who God is? Now, I love to just look at the whole Genesis story and see how every time God would create, he would speak to a substance from which he would create something new. So, for instance, and this is, there's beautiful places at which it touches with science, but Genesis is in the first instance not the historic, factual, scientific account. It's people telling stories about how we understand God brought us into being. And so whenever God creates something new, he speaks to the substance from which he makes this new thing. For instance, when he wants to make fish and the creatures of the sea, he speaks to the sea. And he says, sea, bring forth fish, etc. When he wants to make plants, animals, he speaks to the substance from which plants and animals are made, and he speaks to the earth, and he says, earth, bring forth. And then when he decides to make man, he speaks to the substance from which man is made. And he says, us, bring forth man, our image, our likeness. In other words, you began in God. And as such, you have no beginning, nor end. There's a part of you that originates in God. Yes, there's a part of you that's off this earth. But when God speaks to himself and he says, us, bring forth man. Now, in the first place, God is a relationship. In other words, when we think of God, we don't think of this individual singularity in the beginning, rather bored, thinking, I need some entertainment. Let's make man. Neither was he in a place of neither is God just a grumpy old judge, thinking, I need some victims. God, from the very beginning, Jesus comes to give us a definition of eternity that is way beyond the philosophies of Plato and these guys. And he, come in. Oh, well, that's such an inspirational headgear. Come in. Come misbehave right on the front seat, please. Welcome. You're welcome to keep it up. I don't know what looks better. Both of them is very good. So Jesus comes to give us a definition of what eternity is and what God is. Now, in the Platonic, in the Greek thought, eternity is the opposite of time. So they would look at time and they would say, time is this constant movement. It is this constant change. It is this constant dynamic temporal realm. And so eternity must be the opposite of time. And so they defined eternity as the stable center, the motionless center in the middle of circling time. So in the Hellenic, the Greek thought, eternity is static, motionless, eternal truth. But Jesus comes to give us a whole new definition of eternity, because, that relationship between time and eternity is quite negative. Eternity is everything time is not. And so when you perceive eternity as the opposite of time, then religion becomes the promise of escaping time. And God doesn't want us to escape time. He's got no desire to bring your time to an end. His desire is to bring your time to its fulfillment, to invade your time with his eternity. And so Jesus comes to give us a new definition of eternity in John 17, verse 24. He says, Father, I pray that they may be with me where I am, that they may behold the glory you have given me and the love with which you loved me before this world began. In other words, he reveals that God's eternity is not this static, motionless, boring, abstract place. No, God's eternity is the most dynamic movement of gift-giving, the most dynamic relationship and romance you can ever imagine. And so when you see that as the definition of eternity, it's the very movements within God that is eternity. And so time is no longer the opposite of eternity. Time is the created equivalent of the uncreated movements within God. So time is designed to prolong the anticipation and the joy of this romance. So, let us. When God says, let us create, what is it that He wants to create? It is out of this romance, out of this fullness. It's not out of, this place of intimacy and enjoyment. God's not sitting in this place of fulfillment thinking, what kind of creature can I create that will irritate me for all eternity? He's not in this place of intimacy thinking, what kind of being can I bring into being that will frustrate the living daylights out of me for the rest of my life? No, in this place of intimacy, God is imagining a being so much like Himself that this being will partake of this intimacy and this fellowship without reducing the quality. Without reducing the joy and the expression of this relationship which is God. And so He designs man as an image and the likeness of the relationship that He is. In other words, you cannot be yourself by yourself. You were designed as a being that reflects. You were designed as a being in relationship. Unlike just animals that are mostly bound by their instinct and you can train them, etc., but they basically are what they are. Humanity is created with this unique capacity of being able to become whatever you behold. You are created as a being who reflects, a being who mirrors. Now, this capacity of humanity to reflect and to mirror is attested to in many different sciences. In biology, in psychology, in anthropology, and we're going to look a bit about anthropology today. But just on a biological level, they've discovered, and you can go Google this, they've discovered things called mirror cells in the human brain. And what this basically does is, how they discovered it is, it was first of all with primates, where they saw that if a monkey has a banana, they had them all geared up, and they started seeing that there's what fired whenever he ate a banana. And then by pure accident, somebody walked past while this monkey was looking at another monkey having a banana, and all the same things fired in their brain. And so they started study on humans. And yes, there's mirror cells. There's cells which means that you perceiving or seeing somebody else eating something, doing something, fires the same kind of brain activity as if you were eating that banana yourself. So even on a biological level, there's evidence of this. That you are made as a being in relationship. You are made as a being who reflect. Now, we're going to get to the anthropological meaning of that, but let's take it step by step. So man's created to reflect this relationship. Man's created as a being who cannot be himself by himself. You can only be yourself in relationship with God, in reflecting Him. Now, who is this God that we are made to reflect? And He displays who He is so clearly in verse 28, where God blessed man, and that word barak. It's the word that was used for if I come to you, and we still use that word in the same term, if I give you something, I bless you. And at the root of that Hebrew word is the same word for kneeling. And so the Hebrew linguist tells us that to barak is an act of adoration, such as kneeling. It's the act in which I honor you by giving you gifts and adoring you. Now what this Genesis 1:28 says is that man's first conscious experience was of his maker, his creator, his God, adoring him. And now what did Adam do on that first day to deserve any adoration? God didn't make Adam and mankind on day one and said, come on you lazy bones, I need some help. Let's help me create this world, and then, if you perform well, then maybe I'll give you some praise at the end. No, God only creates man after everything is finished, and before man has got any opportunity to perform. I see it as part of the creative act, that part of what makes man is God designed you as a being to be adored. And so our first conscious experience is of a God who adores us. And the most natural thing to do for a being that's designed as a being that reflects and images is to reflect that adoration back. Is to just immediately respond with the same kind of overwhelming adoration. So man's created, day 6, everything's finished. The only thing left to do for man is to appreciate the perfection of what God has done. And that's the Sabbath rest. You can imagine if you are fortunate enough to have a Van Gogh hanging in your house, how, Van Gogh would have painted that picture, stood back, put a few more brushes on it, stood back. But there came a moment where Van Gogh put that last brush stroke on, he stood back, he put his brush down, and he entered his rest. A rest of satisfaction. So the Sabbath rest is not God being worn out and tired and thinking, I need a break. The Sabbath rest is God has completed His most complete artistic expression. And as He puts His final brush stroke on His self-portrait called man, He stands back and He puts the brush down and He says, this is very good. I'm just entering my rest of satisfaction. And so man is created to reflect. And the only way in which we adore God accurately is to reflect the adoration He gives us. In other words, you don't honor God by telling Him how rubbish you are. You don't honor any father by telling him what a mess his children are. You honor the Father by acknowledging the perfection of His workmanship. And so can you see, man, in our very design, we are created as beings who reflect. Now Genesis 3 starts telling us of what we what we call the fall of man, and basically it introduces us to the concept that man started heeding whispering voices, and these whispering voices basically suggested that God is withholding something from you. Now, you can't eat from this tree because God doesn't want you to be like Him. Now, what happens when we perceive God as withholding that tree from us because He doesn't want us to have something? The effect is we think God must desire that tree more than any other tree. He wants it for Himself. That's why He doesn't want us to have it. and the very suggestion that God is withholding that tree from us because He desires it makes that tree so desirable for us because we are made to reflect, and when we perceive wrongly, but we still perceive that God is withholding that tree, that misperception makes that tree more desirable. Why? Because we reflect the desires we perceive. We perceived it wrong. You see, sin occurred when man mistook God as a rival. In other words, God was not withholding anything from us. You see, this is the God who even gave you His image likeness. In the very way in which He designed you, He's not withholding anything from you because He desires it more than you. No, the truth is God desired an innocent humanity. His desire was always towards us. And so man heeds this suggestion that God is withholding. And as we misconceive God, as we misinterpret God's desire, we start reflecting that desire. And when we lose sight of who God is, who are we going to reflect? So this is what I want you to start seeing in anthropological terms. Is anthropology is basically just the study of human origins, how we develop societies and how we maintain those societies. Mankind's history. And when a person forgets who God is, by your very design, you are still going to reflect someone or something. And what happens then is we start reflecting one another. Now, to give you a very simple illustration of how this works is if you imagine a toddler, say a 3-year-old, sitting in a room full of toys, not giving particular attention to any specific toy, and another 3-year-old walks in, the first thing the new 3-year-old will notice is the other 3-year-old. And the second thing he will notice is the toy closest to the other 3-year-old. And he will head over to that toy. And the moment he reaches out for that toy, the first 3-year-old will realize that that's the toy he's always wanted. And reach for it as well. And war breaks out. And that is a summary of human history. That is on a very small scale. I mean, we learn to control it. We learn to kind of become more social, and we just escalate these rivalistic inclinations to national scale. But basically, what happened there is what happens throughout life. People don't even trust their own desires. They look at others to tell them what they desire.
Come on.
And so mankind, in their bewilderment, in forgetting the one who adores them, suddenly adoration becomes twisted and it becomes accusation. The very quality in which that was supposed to be used with which I would validate you now becomes suspicion. The very quality in which I would reflect trust now becomes fear. And so all these reflective qualities, when we take our model, our creator out of the equation, it becomes the perversion of what it was designed to be. And so, I've got something there. So let's think about how this works in early human communities. You can imagine a group of 20 or 30 people. Now, if you want more detailed understanding of the development of human societies and this is called mimetic realism or mimetic theory. A guy called Rabe, who's just basically as an intellectual, he, not as a believer first of all, he analyzed and deconstructed literature and also all the mythology throughout human history. And he came upon this understanding of how sacrifice works and how it is connected to mimetic theory. And one of the books that caused a big outrage when it was first published was called The Violence and the Sacred. Because he basically showed how all religious systems began in violence. Now, how does this happen? You can imagine an early human community of 30, 40 people, a group like this, coming together because it is convenient for survival. And it is in an environment in which there's no laws, there's no rules. It is just we're starting to find out how this relationship works and what is beneficial within a community. Now, in a community where there are no rules or regulations, with people who are constantly reflecting one another's desires, I might see that, hey, you like black and white cows. And so suddenly, I also want black and white cows. But there's only so many black and white cows. And so this reflective quality is turned into competition. And it's turned into rivalry. And rivalry within a community where there's no rules or regulations escalates. And violence starts to escalate. And even the 10 Commandments have this escalation of wrong desire built into it. From Commandment 6, you shall not murder, shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness. It's as if the writer is understanding, I can go on and on with shall not. Let's get to the heart of it. Commandment 10, you shall not desire what is your neighbor's. I like the old King James. It says, you shall not desire your neighbor's ass. But the new translation says, you shall not desire your neighbor's donkey. Okay. I thought I'll just interpret that for you correctly. So Commandment 10 basically gives us the whole source, the core of all these problems is we are reflecting one another's desires, and because we are reflecting one another's desires, it leads to, if we read it in reverse order, you shall not bear false witness. It leads to all kinds of deceptive dealing. It eventually leads to stealing. It eventually leads to me wanting to take what is most precious to you, because I want to replace you in adultery. And if it goes unchecked, it basically leads to murder. The ultimate of where it goes to is violence. And humans, like no other creatures, other animals can have a fight, and one will realize, he's stronger than me, I better get out of here. But humans will just carry on until somebody dies. We don't know when to quit this rivalry. And so within early human communities, you can see how the conflict within this community starts escalating, and the boundaries within the community starts disintegrating until it comes to such a fervent point that the whole community is going to disintegrate, because violence always escalates. Now, I hit one of your teeth out, you hit all 7 out. I break your arm, you're going to break both my legs. Okay, I kill you. Okay, we're going to kill 7 of your family. Okay, so it always escalates. And so it reaches a point within early human communities that the whole community is going to disintegrate. And it is at that point that humanity has discovered what Caiaphas spoke of in, I think it's John 11, verse 50. It is better for one person to die than for the whole nation, the whole community, to perish. So at this point of fervent rivalry and the society being broken apart, what we find in all early human communities is that human sacrifice is at the heart of every early civilization. Because what happens when this whole group is in this place of disorientation and of confusion, of violence, and we can see everyone's going to destroy one another, it becomes very convenient to choose a scapegoat. Now, the mechanism in which we choose a scapegoat is, first of all, the person just needs to be a bit different. The smallest or the tallest, the ugliest or the most beautiful. Something about you is different. And if you don't have a huge family circle or friendship circle, that's very beneficial because it reduces the likelihood for reprisals. So an outcast makes an ideal scapegoat. And so you can imagine in this place of fervor where a scapegoat is identified and all the rivalry suddenly congeals in a focus of we're going to take all our frustration out on this one scapegoat, because there's nothing that reconciles old enemies more than finding a common enemy. Hey, I'm no longer mad at you about us having a fight about the cow. Let's just all get together and exert our frustration on this one scapegoat. And so all mythology, René Girard does a brilliant job in his book called Scapegoat, in which he goes through many of the myths and shows that at the heart of all these myths is an innocent victim that was sacrificed for the sake of the community. And what happens when we now exert our violence against that one individual is we got rid of all our frustration, we got rid of all our anger, a magical peace ensues. Just like, when all the fervor and the confusion of the crucifixion was over, there was a peace that ensued on the whole city. It always happens. We've all now got rid of the frustration. We've murdered this victim. This peace ensues, and because we never recognize the source of evil, the source of our problem, we think that there's something magical about the scapegoat and about the sacrifice, because we never realize that, the source of our problems is not that the gods was angry with one specific person. The source of our confusion is we have lost sight of the one whom we are made to reflect. And because we lost sight of him and partook of a different kind of knowledge, because if we take the scripture seriously, we've got to say this, that at the heart of evil, according to this account, the most prominent picture of evil is a tree of a certain kind of knowledge. And therefore, evil would have had no existence within this world if mankind did not give it space and room through partaking of a certain kind of knowledge. And so, because we don't recognize the source of the evil, within this community in which a magical peace now ensued, and all kinds of myths develop. I mean, why is there such a peace? Why was the community falling apart, but now it is stable? There must have been something very evil about that scapegoat. And it must have pleased the gods that we got rid of him. And therefore, if you ask all sacrificing communities, why do you sacrifice? They've got two answers. One, it is to maintain the order within society. And two, it is because the gods require it. Those are the two answers they always give. So can you see within this framework how it is our confusion and our mimetic rivalry that leads to violence, that brings us to the first victim of our violence? And now what happens 6 months down the line is we irritate one another once again, because we've never dealt with the source of the problem. So I'm mad at you again because you've got more black and white cows than I. And the rivalry starts stirring again because we've not dealt with the source. And when this rivalry escalates to a certain level, we remember what sorted out the problem last time. It was a sacrifice. So we suddenly make the sacrificial system a ritual. We repeat it. Because, and many of the primitive rituals that they've studied, the people even in the play before the sacrifice, they even emulate the confusion and the chaos that led up to the sacrifice. Because they don't understand why the sacrifice solved it, so they replay the whole history. The rivalry, the confusion, the chaos, and then everyone suddenly becomes one in their focus of violence upon one scapegoat. So the initial murder becomes a ritual. And with the rituals, religion has its origin. Can you see that religion has got the most barbaric, violent, satanic origins? what happens over time is that religion becomes the very foundation of civilizations. Even within the time of Jesus, all our institutions still had a religious rite that went with it. So long before the Department of Education, there was a religious rite that took you from childhood to adulthood. It was your rite of entrance into a full member of the community. Over time, that religious rite became our Department of Education. In the days of Jesus, the rites were still very much integrated with the religious rituals. The institutions and the rituals went hand in hand. Today, we want to desperately forget our religious origins and we just want the institutions. But the very fabric of society is built upon religious rites that has their origin in a brutal, violent murder. Now, our myths try to hide it. And so in that sense, a myth, yes, is a lie, but the myths always had an element of truth in it. And this is what's done so well in The Scapegoat, how he shows that in our myths, we always want to say, hey, the scapegoat deserved it. He was guilty of the most heinous crimes. And we were obviously innocent in murdering him. Or it will take another route. It will always try to hide the violence. It will say, hey, this guy was a volunteer. The gods were angry. They weren't going to let the sun come up. It's the Mayan myth. And so they needed one amongst them to volunteer to jump into the fire. Well, two of them volunteered. The one was told, you will volunteer. And in this myth, the person walks to the edge of the fire, but it's too hot. He doesn't have the courage. He walks back. He walks to the edge of the fire again. But it's too hot. He doesn't have the courage. But with the encouragement of his brethren who formed a circle around him, he eventually jumped in. So that is how these myths develop. But can you see that at the heart of that myth was a brutal, violent murder? There was no volunteering. And so what so amazed René Girard is when he started reading the scriptures, after he spent ages deconstructing the myths, he suddenly realized that the biblical stories follows the same mythical storyline, but at every point where the myths try to hide the truth, the scriptures reveal it. In other words, the Bible also has a story of an initial murder that is the beginning of civilization. Cain is the first person to establish the city of the Canaanites. He is also the first murderer. But what is different in the biblical story, it doesn't try to cover what happened. It doesn't try to say, well, Abel was really causing a lot of hassles and really he deserved it and Cain's really innocent. No, the Bible just says this is murder. This was wrong. And so the Bible follows the same storyline, but what is absolutely unique in the scriptures is its story is from the point of view of the victim, not from the victor. Now, most of history is written from the point of view of the victor. But the Bible is written from the point of view of slaves, of innocent victims. And the blood of innocent victims have always cried for justice, for vengeance. That's the first thing Abel's blood calls for. We want vengeance. We want justice. So let me summarize quickly again so that you follow me in this story. Man, created in the image and likeness of God, is a being that is made to reflect. We are made to reflect Him. And our ability to reflect should lead, it's designed for this purpose, to lead us into the joy of intimacy. The most meaningful, deepest, satisfying relationship. That is what it's designed for. When it becomes perverted, that very quality of reflection has the opposite result. It leads us to isolation, where our most meaningful relationship is one of rivalry, expressed in violence. There is nothing that will fill an event with more meaning than love or violence. You put love or violence into an event, it becomes important, becomes meaningful. And so man in our twisted mindset begins our rivalry and our violence, and violence just escalates and escalates and escalates. God gives mankind the freedom to tell our own stories, to live our own lives, and to experience the full consequences of our own stories. And after we've experienced, and when I say our own stories, I don't just mean fiction. I mean that we have actually lived and experienced our own concepts and our own perceptions. We've lived it out. And the very societies that we are part of is part of the human story, is part of human wisdom. And so it is this wisdom that God comes to subvert. Now, how does He subvert this wisdom? He does it by entering into conversation with us. Because it is, you don't change somebody's mind by simply telling them, you're wrong. You need to think differently. Try this. And people are most receptive for information when they are persuaded that you understand them. And so God enters into a conversation with humanity, and He enters this conversation on a level that humanity can understand, and in a time where human sacrifices are common. Now, obviously, over time, human sacrifices were substituted with animal sacrifices because, humans are difficult. They fight back, they're expensive to keep, and you've got to have eventually a war machine to supply you with enough sacrifices. So it's an expensive business. So human sacrifices were eventually replaced by human sacrifices, and animal sacrifices, and animal sacrifices was replaced by food, wine, bread, etc. But its origins is still that initial brutal murder. So God enters a conversation with humanity during a time where sacrificial systems are common. And He comes to Abraham and He says to Abraham, sacrifice to me Isaac. Now that is a common request. You would expect such a request from any of the gods during those days. What's happening here? Is God just like all our other imaginary gods? No, God is entering into a conversation with humanity on a level that we can understand. And Abraham brings Isaac right to the point of he's about to sacrifice him. and God stops him. Why? You see, this is God entering into our mythology, entering into our confusion. And at the very point at which we are about to commit this murder, he stops us. And in effect, he is saying, I am not like all the other gods. If there's any sacrifice to be made, it is one that I will supply. And he turned around. And you know, there's the goat caught in the thickets, and he supplies his own sacrifice. Even throughout the Old Testament, the rite of atonement within the Old Covenant is such an interesting picture, because in God entering in and giving us all these sacrificial systems, he always puts a twist in them. Because he's starting to subvert it. Because at the same time in which he's introducing sacrifices, he also continuously tells the prophets, remember that it is not me who required sacrifices and offerings. You can read it, Psalms 40. Remember, your sacrifices and offerings I have not required. Okay, so God's entering a conversation for whose sake? For our sake. He doesn't require sacrifices and offerings, but this is our best idea we could come up with about who God is and how to deal with evil in society. And so he enters into our story to turn our story upside down from the inside out. And so he's speaking sacrificial language, because that's what we understand. And he introduces the rite of atonement. Now, atonement, some people thought it just meant to cover, but they got that confusion from, part of the word, it comes from the word covering, but like a tent covering, when you get a tear in that covering, to atone is to bring that tear together again and to mend it and to make it one. So atonement is not to cover over. Atonement is to make it whole and one again. God's not interested in just covering our issues. He wants to heal it. And so a better way to think of atonement, whenever you think of that word atonement, just pronounce it a bit differently. Pronounce it at one-ment. At one-ment. And so God, he introduces this rite of atonement in the Old Testament. And you remember the tabernacle. Now, everything that happens in the Old Testament is a picture of the relationship God desires with you. Even the tabernacle, it's a mobile dwelling place covered in skin. Does that sound familiar? God had you in mind in all these pictures. And so within this tabernacle, the high priest once a year would slaughter a bull for the purification of his own sin. He would then enter the temple and he would clothe himself with a pure white clothing. And from now on, this is where the twist happens. This is what makes this rite different from all the other pagan ideas. From now on, he didn't just represent the people to God. He was representing God to the people, because he would have the little leather boxes on his arms and his forehead, and in it was written the name of Yahweh, and he was now known as the messenger or the angel of the Lord. And one of the names of the angel or the messenger of the Lord was the Son of God. And he would take with him into that temple two lambs, and which would also be slaughtered. One was called Azazel, and one was called the Lord. So you see, something very different is happening here. God's idea of atonement, and he would sacrifice the Lord, and he would take his blood into the Holy of Holies for the purification. Now, that's such a beautiful word, because if the temple, if this tabernacle is representing us, then we've got to see that there's a place within this tabernacle that God calls the Holy of Holies. And for the Jewish people, this place called the Holy of Holies was not just another space on earth. This was beyond all space or time, because Yahweh himself dwelt there. This was the place from which all of creation was held in existence. In fact, they thought of the Holy of Holies as a microcosm of the whole universe. Wow. And so God, even he promises, when he sets up the tabernacle, he says, there I will meet with you. And that word meet is an intimate word. And so the high priest would enter that most holy place, sprinkle the blood, and if I don't remember to tell this to you after we've spoken about Jesus being the perfect sacrifice, please remind me of this again. Because the sprinkling of the blood brings purification in the Holy of Holies. Now, what is happening here? What is different? You see, the pagan ideas of we bring a sacrifice to appease angry gods. There's hints even in the Old Testament already that says, no, it is God who takes the initiative to sacrifice the Lord to purify your conscience.
Yes.
This is a very different picture. Because unfortunately, we have overlaid our mythology onto the cross of Jesus Christ. And we have said that this is the event that God required to satisfy his bloodlust, to change his mind concerning us. Now, we haven't used those words. Those are obviously too controversial. What we've said is, God is love, but he's also just. And so we use words that's a bit more abstract. We want to stay away from the blood and the guts and all of those things that happened at the cross. We'll use abstract words. So God is love, but he is also just. And his justice requires that sin be punished. Can I get you two guys up here quick? Can you stand on either side of me? Thank you. And so this basically began, this theory of satisfaction began with Anselm who was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 11th century, wanting to retell the story of atonement. And living in a very hierarchical society, what he basically said is that we've got to understand sin and atonement. Let me give you an example. If two peasants have a fight, and she hits my tooth out, and we go to the judge will say, well, you can hit her tooth out again also, and you square, it's all okay. But if I go to my landlord and I hit his tooth out, the judge will tell the landlord, well, you can break his arm and hit all his teeth out, and then you equal. Because sin hasn't got to do with the act, it's got to do with whom I offend. In other words, if I hit the king's tooth out, I'm dead. And my family, there's just no way. And so in Anselm's understanding of sin and atonement, mankind has sinned against an infinitely good and perfect God. And therefore there is no way, no matter what you've done, there's no way you're going to ever pay back. Because God is offended. And God is infinite. So God is infinitely offended. He is ticked off to the highest degree. And for him to torture you for all eternity would just be right. No matter what you did. Now, however familiar you are with that story, that only became popular after the 11th century. It became more and more exaggerated throughout the ages. But the first Christians did not understand atonement in those terms at all. You see, what that picture basically says is that God is ticked off at humanity. And yes, he's put in these sacrificial systems, but they're not quite working, and mankind's continually messing up in any case. And Jesus basically, he sees his father's getting more and more ticked off. And he knows his father. He can see he's getting ready to beat somebody to death. And so he steps into the gap and says, Father, you can punish me instead of them. I'll take the bullet for them. I'll take the penalty of their sin so that they can be free. And so if that is our understanding of atonement, then it means that humanity is very comfortable with Jesus because, he's the nice part of God. But we just hope he never leaves the room. Leaves us alone with that other part of God who's easily offended. And so if you break down that theory of atonement to its basic message, what it is saying is Jesus came to save us from the Father. Can you see how we have imposed our mythology onto the cross of Christ? How our ideas of angry deities who needs to be appeased through blood. Because for all of our talk about justice, when we actually look at the event in which we say that justice occurred, it was the brutal, unjust murder of Jesus that we say, please the Father. So, this picture of atonement, I hope you realize that I don't think God has been our problem. I don't think we need to be saved from God. Thank you, guys. I've got a whole different picture of atonement to bring to you, and that is the incarnation. Jesus is not a third party in between man and God. Jesus is fully man and fully God in his person. There is the perfect harmony and reconciliation of God and man. And therefore reconciliation begins in the incarnation, not on the cross. Okay, it escalates, the message escalates, but it begins in God taking the initiative to unite himself with humanity. Now you might say this must be a very uneasy union, because how does a pure and holy and blameless God, how does he unite himself with a fallen humanity? A humanity that's alien in their mindset, at enmity against God, according to Colossians 2. I mean, this must be a very difficult union. Something's got to give. Yes. Either God's going to lose his innocence, or man's going to lose their sin. But God's not letting go. Either God's going to become as fallen as we are, or we are going to be raised together with him and seated in heavenly places at the place of glory and honor for which he has destined us. But God is not letting go. Something very different happens in Jesus, because you see, he comes to summarize the whole of human history. I'll just mention the scriptures. You can go look them up. But Jesus says, the blood of all innocent victims, from the blood of Abel. Can you see how he is summarizing the whole of human history? Human history has been this. We don't know what the problem is, so we will find somebody to blame. It is somebody else, and it's an angry God. That's our problem. That has been human mythology. That is human wisdom. Upon which civilizations has been built, the law of retribution. You must get what you deserve. And so he comes to summarize all of human history, and he says all the innocent blood of all victims is going to come onto this generation. Because Jesus, he's starting to understand that, because he wasn't born omniscient. He wasn't born knowing all things. He had to grow in wisdom and knowledge. In conversation with his Father, these things are revealed. And so he is getting ready to bring our scapegoating mechanism, our mythologies about who God is, who we are, and what evil is. He's about to bring all of that to a final conclusion. And so when John sees Jesus, he says, "This is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." In other words, something very different is happening here. This is not your sacrifice to appease God. This is God's initiative to change your angry minds. You were the angry deities who demanded blood, not God. You see, we esteemed him smitten and stricken by God. Let me not get there. That's too soon. We'll get to the cross now. Let's first go through a few other things. You know, a little while before his death and resurrection, he asks people, he says, a king went to a far country, and he left his vineyard in the care of stewards, and he would send a servant saying, "Give me my portion of the harvest." And they killed the servant. And they did that many times. Eventually he said, "I'll send my son. Surely they will respect him." Can you see that the king's initiative is not to send his son to go and die? His hope is that they would listen. But the reality is, they see the son and they say, "Let's kill him too." And the whole vineyard will be ours. And so he asks the crowd, what should be done? And they are all in agreement. It is judgment time. He should come and destroy them utterly. You see, Jesus is setting them up for understanding this. We're going to, I must get to the conclusion of that story, but we've got to set it up. Even at the Passover feast, the Passover meal, you know, Jesus takes our symbols, our wine and our bread, and he says, "No, let's put in their place what is actually happening here. Let's put the human sacrifice back. This wine is actually my blood. This bread is actually my body. let's get beyond the symbolism and see that something very real is going to happen here. And so the cross is a massive contradiction. We have only seen we've allowed the whole event to be swallowed up in sacred awe, in such a way that we have lost sight of what God is exposing. I think what he exposes is so clear when he speaks to Judas and he says that the Son of Man has to go, just as it has been written of him. But woe to the man who through whom he is betrayed. In other words, this is part of God's plan, but it is wrong. Can you see the contradiction in those verses? This has to happen. But woe to those who involve themselves in this event, but that has to happen. There's a massive contradiction in the cross. Now, the way in which we've resolved it is we've basically said God has done it all. God's the one who kills Jesus, raises him, and he's pleased with the whole event. You know, when they start preaching after the day of Pentecost, whenever they mention the death of Christ, they never say that God killed Jesus. They always say, you murdered him.
Oh my God.
You crucified him. You put him to death. God raised him. In other words, there's something very important happening here. If the death of Jesus is the payment that was required to satisfy God's sense of justice, then the death of Christ would have taken care of the debt of sin. Is that logical? If the death of Christ is the penalty that was required in order to appease God, to satisfy God that I will no longer hold your sin against you, then the death of Christ would have solved the sin problem. But it doesn't. That's why Paul says, if Christ was not raised, you would still be in your sin. In other words, it is not his death that solves the sin problem. It is his resurrection. Okay, so what is happening here? You see, this is the point in which God is going to allow humanity to sink to our deepest alienation from him. He's going to allow our best institutions, represented by Rome, the very civilization built upon human sacrifice. He's going to allow this achievement of mankind to expose itself for what it really is. Because, you know, the reason we kill our scapegoats is because we want to silence them forever. We did not expect that the scapegoat's going to speak again. This is the place in which God allows our best attempts at religion, represented by the Sanhedrin, to expose himself. Because it is both the religious leaders and the institutions of man that is brought together in a frenzy of confusion and conflict, just like the first human sacrifice. And just when the circumstances is right, they all congeal, and Herod and Pilate, who were enemies, becomes friends on the day when they find a common enemy in Jesus. And they say, let's exert our frustrations on him. Now, obviously, you know, if we were there, we wouldn't have been part of the crowd, would we? Peter was so confident, I will not deny you. You see, this is a summary of human history. We don't blame the Jews or the Romans. This is God revealing the heart of humanity if we are confused and we don't have our true model in view anymore. If God is not the one we reflect, we will murder the true God for the sake of our imaginary gods. And so this is the moment in which humanity, we murder our Maker unjustly, not tried in the right way, brutally. We esteemed him smitten and stricken by God, but it was our transgression. It was our sin that nailed him to that cross. You see, no matter what sin you've committed, the one that tops it all is if you kill your Maker, your Creator. All other sins are included in this, in this act. So we were the ones who bruised him, and how did he respond? With healing. You see, at this point where humanity is at their worst, God reveals who he is. And he says, Father, forgive them. In other words, he doesn't wait for us to realize how wrong we were. He doesn't wait for us to repent and confess. He waits for us to be at our worst, dead in our trespasses and sin, at our ugliest. That's where he says, okay, now I'm going to reveal to you the heart of God. Father, forgive them. He takes the very opportunity where evil is most real. And evil was incarnate, not in a red little horned creature running with a fork. But evil became incarnate in the brutality and the violence of man. The cross is where evil is most real. Where we murder God. God incarnate meets evil incarnate. And in the face of the worst evil, God responds with forgiveness. What is happening here? God is showing us that, hey, even if you at your worst, I remain forgiving. Now, if it must bring you face to face with this reality. God is not your problem. Can I shake you loose from your mythology? And he doesn't come it by just, he doesn't just come into our world and write a nice little new myth. Let me give you a new little story which will hopefully change your mind about who God is. No, he does it by entering into our story himself, and in his own life and death, he rewrites what we believe concerning God. And what he reveals is God is not your problem. Even when you are at your worst, God remains forgiving and embracing. He reveals that our scapegoats, our conveniently chosen scapegoats, are innocent. And that means we've got to go and look for the source of evil much closer than what we're comfortable with. You see, he comes to save us, not from an angry God, but from our own illusions about who God is and who we are. This is why 1 John 5:20 says he came to give us understanding, that we may know him who is true. And we are in him who is true. In other words, the whole mission of Jesus is to bring us understanding. And he is busy subverting the whole foundation upon which civilization has been built. The foundation of retributive justice. And retributive justice means I give you what you deserve. Now that theory, I'm going to just finish preaching, then we can have so I'm going to take time to complete this, and then we won't have a full second session. We'll just have maybe questions and answers. So hang on there for a few more minutes. Okay, I want to complete this story. Retributive justice says that you must get what you deserve. It's what our systems are built on. And that theory, basically that theory of atonement that says that the death of Jesus is the payment that satisfies God's sense of justice, that completely separates the event of the cross from the life and teaching of Jesus. Because it contradicts what Jesus plainly taught. Because that theory says that God cannot forgive unless he's got full payment. Now, if you pay your speeding ticket in full, do you need to be forgiven? No, you've paid the penalty. Now, Jesus, some of the disciples came to him and said, Lord, I've got a brother of mine who's really getting on my nerves. How often should I forgive him? Maybe up to 7 times. And Jesus uses a hyperbole, just a saying, which meant infinity. He said not 7 times, but 70 times 7. In other words, if Jesus believed in sins only being forgiven if they are paid in full, he should have responded, if your brother sins against you, make sure that you don't forgive him until he has paid you in full. And then forgive him. But this is not what Jesus teaches. He just says, hey, forgive. Continually. You see, that theory of atonement makes sin so powerful that it is actually able to split the Father and the Son at the cross. To split the very unity of who God is. Where we have had this idea of God saying, oh goodness, I'm out of here. I'm going to leave the Son to suffer on his own because I'm too holy to look at sin. If God was too holy to look at sin, he should never have become a man. You see, what happened on this cross is that God faced our sin, eye to eye. Like never before. He faced our evil. He faced our brutality. This is not God. Where was God the Father at the crucifixion? 2 Corinthians 5:19. It was God who was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. You see, this is not the event in which God the Father forsakes the Son. When Jesus cries out, remember, Jesus is fully God, fully human. When he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He is our representative. As man, on our behalf, he cries out what fallen humanity has been thinking. My God, why? You see, he assumes even our doubt so that we can become partakers of his faith. This is the place where he identifies with us in the deepest possible way. And no sooner has he asked that question than he answers that question by entering our hell for us. And by entering our hell for us, he answers us. He's saying, listen, I will rather go to hell than forsake you. You can read it in Psalms 22, verse 23 and 24. the truth comes out. God has never forsaken the afflicted, nor has he turned his face from us. Okay, now let's move on to the really good part. The resurrection. You see, if you do want a legal picture of what happened at the cross, let me present you with this picture. Humanity, all of us, are charged with the most heinous crime. You have murdered the Prince of Life. And this is the first message ever preached. We should get a hint from it. You know, Peter says to the very people who murdered him, this Jesus whom you and your leaders have murdered. In other words, here we are, humanity as a whole. Our whole story is summarized. And the conclusion of the story we have told ourselves is we have murdered the true God for the sake of our imaginary gods. So here we are in court. The accusation is read out. Can you imagine yourself in court? This is the eternal court in which judgment is going to be passed. And the accusation which is against you is read. You have murdered the Prince of Life. The first witness is called in. And the witness who walks in is Jesus, very much alive, the one whom we are accused of murdering is walking into the court, very much alive. This means that a verdict of guilty of murder is very unlikely. This is why Paul says, you have been saved by the resurrection. You see, God allowed us to do our worst, to take our guilt beyond any dispute. And when we were as evil as we could be, as guilty as we could be, He just reverses what we've done. And so when Peter preaches and he speaks to the very people who was involved in that act, and he says, this Jesus whom you and your leaders have murdered, they are cut to the heart. Why? They can still remember their own judgment that they gave a few days before, a few weeks before. They said, it is judgment time, come and destroy them. Now, if there's any sense of vengeance in God, if God has got any desire to get equal, to balance the books, to give you what you deserve, the resurrection is the ideal opportunity for Him to come and say, you have murdered the wrong guy. I'm back. But Peter presents to them their victim coming towards them with forgiveness. He takes Jesus out of every paradigm of retributive justice we have imagined. And he reveals that God's justice is not to get even. It's not to give you what you deserve, but to give you what you need to be healed. His justice is restorative. His justice is healing. Can you see that? Ooh, such fun. I love it. Oh man, there's so many things I need to say about this. So it was God who was in Christ, reconciling the world to Himself. What does He reveal concerning Himself? He reveals that He has always been for us and not against us. that He is our salvation. He is not the one that we need salvation from. Okay. He reveals that human wisdom, the principles upon which we have built all our religions and society itself, because the Christian understanding of retributive justice that is embraced by much of the Christian world, where we've put our pagan ideas, our pagan mythology, where we've put that onto the cross of Christ, that has given birth to more wars and more brutality than anything else. Because if you believe that ultimately God solves the problem of evil with violence, then you will feel quite justified that that is the way we need to ultimately deal with evil. In other words, violence is redemptive. Violence is what's going to help us. Violence can be very bad, but if it's in the hands of the right people, then it's all right. No, you will never overcome evil with evil. See, this is the whole satanic circle of Satan casting out Satan. The very accuser that causes the conflict within societies then brings about the solution with the sacrificial system, which is just focused violence, in order to maintain the circle of violence. God comes to break into that circle and reveal that violence will never be redemptive. You see, what makes the blood of Jesus powerful is not some mythical, magical quality that pleased God. What makes the blood of Jesus powerful is what we read of in Hebrews 12, that it speaks of better things than the blood of Abel. What did the blood of Abel and every innocent victim, what did it speak? What was its message? It cried for vengeance. It cried for retribution. What makes the blood of Jesus powerful, as He is the ultimate innocent scapegoat, and His blood is now sprinkled in your conscience. And His blood calls for one thing: forgiveness. Even when you act your worst, God forgives. If you have to summarize Jesus' message, is, hey, learn to forgive or you're going to destroy yourselves. Very simple. Awesome. So, you know what? Let's take, it's 11 o'clock now. Let's take 15, 20 minutes to have a break, have a drink, and then during this time, if you've got questions, can you write them down on a piece of paper? And when we come back, I'm going to deal with some of those questions. Is that all right? So just bring me some of your questions on a piece of paper. Let's take a 15-minute break. Do you want to do a song now, or shall we? We'll start the session with a song. Yeah. After this. Thank you. Isn't he amazing?